And here I have this article in Salvo magazine, an interview with Nancy Pearcey, and here's what she says when she's asked about her own intellectual journey. She said, because she was trying to figure the world out, and though she was, she was raised in a Christian home, she began to challenge and question her own convictions, and she couldn't find anybody that would give her good reasons to believe in Christianity. She said, when I could not get any substantial answers, I decided the only intellectually honest thing to do was to reject my religious upbringing. Do you hear that? Because she couldn't get any good answers, she figured, well, then there's no good reason to keep believing what I've been believing. In fact, she says that, after all, if you don't have good reasons for something, you should not say you believe it, whether Christianity or anything else. So she began her intentional search for truth and started checking out lots of other religions and philosophies. She's only 15 years old at this time, by the way, reading everything she could find. She said, it did not take long for me to absorb all the secular isms, moral relativism, determinism, and finally radical skepticism. Yet a few years later, when she was living in Europe, she stumbled upon a little group of Christians living in the Alps of Switzerland. The community was called L'Abri, the shelter, and it was run by Francis and Edith Schaeffer. And when she was there, she was stunned to learn that Christianity could be supported by good reasons and rational arguments. It was the first time she was ever exposed to something substantial to justify the religion she was raised in. But there was more, because it wasn't just that, it was also the community. These Christians, they were so different from any she had ever met before. So she stayed there for a month. She didn't become a Christian, but she was impressed. And she didn't want to be drawn into Christianity simply because it was emotionally attractive. She wanted to be drawn into Christianity because it was actually true. So when she was there, though, she had been introduced to apologetics, and having left L'Abri, she writes, or she says here in the interview, that strictly through my own reading, I realized I had become intellectually persuaded of Christianity. So she went back to L'Abri, studied for an additional 4 months, and then began really getting grounded in my understanding of the Christian worldview. And she says, my own experience is the reason I'm passionate about worldview and apologetics. It's the only way I would have accepted Christianity. Wow. Now, Nancy's made a fabulous contribution to Christian thinking, to Christian apologetics. Her books have moved the meter for lots of people. And here she is, though, someone who was a skeptic, who was won to Christ through apologetics. In fact, after converting to Christianity for the first year and a half, that's all she read. And this allowed her to begin understanding the other side, the world. That there was a common secular worldview that was kind of driving everything. She describes it this way. She said, every worldview proposes a kind of box and then tries to fit all of reality into this box. And by the way, I think that's a good way of putting it. I have said in the past that Christianity, I think one should take Christianity seriously because, as I told my 13-year-old when she was about 8, because it's the best explanation for the way things are. There's nothing else that comes close. That is, as a worldview box, everything that we encounter in the world can fit into our box, and it resonates with our deepest intuitions of reality. It has tremendous explanatory power. And we talk about the details of this all the time. But Nancy noticed, and it's something that I've seen too, alternate worldviews encounter lots of things in the world, as it were, that can't fit into their worldview box. In other words, it doesn't fit the world as they view it. And if you have a piece of the world that doesn't fit the world as you view it, that means your worldview is inadequate. And the materialistic worldview box, that is, the view of the world that only matter is real and energy moving around, physical things according to natural law, so that's why materialism is sometimes called physicalism and sometimes called naturalism. They're all synonyms the way I'm using the word. If that's your view, there's some things that just aren't going to fit in there, like morality and like consciousness and a whole bunch of other things like souls or God. And so what happens when very real parts of the world don't fit into your worldview box? You have to just deny their reality. God doesn't exist. Souls don't exist. We're meat all the way down. There is no objective morality, and consciousness is an illusion. Now, I hope you see how wildly counterintuitive those things are, or at least some of them. Consciousness is an illusion? Are you kidding me? Why did they say that? They have to. It doesn't fit in their box. But it's one of the silliest things I've ever heard, because I have a question. What is an illusion? An illusion is when your conscious self is being appeared to in a false way, right? In other words, non-conscious things cannot have illusions. So what do you make of the claim that consciousness itself is an illusion? I got to ask the question, what is having the illusion of consciousness? If only conscious things can have illusions and consciousness itself is an illusion, then I guess the illusion is having the illusion. Doesn't sound right to me. It's obviously self-referentially absurd. It's incoherent. It is contradictory. It commits suicide, to cite a tactic. Anyway, those are just a number of a few things that I could, maybe I'll come back to this article later. Let me finish your thought. Every worldview proposes a box and then tries to fit all of reality into its box, but because its box is a part of the created order, it will always be too small. That was the point I was just making. You can absolutely be sure of that. It is strictly logical, and that will give you the confidence that you will never encounter a worldview or a philosophy or a system of thought that you cannot answer. Only the Christian worldview box holds everything. All the other boxes won't hold everything they need to hold. That shows they're not an adequate worldview. J. Warner Wallace wrote the book God's Crime Scene, and he really played on the same notion. He said, when you have a dead body in a room and you can explain all the details, all the clues and everything from inside of the room, you don't have a homicide, probably. But if you have objects that were the source, the cause of death, like bullets or knives or machetes, that must come from outside of the room, or you have bloody footprints leading outside of the room, you see that there are things that are outside of the room that are relevant to this. That means you can't account for them inside of the room, and that makes a death a homicide case. And his point is, we're looking at the world, and we're trying to explain everything about the world from inside the universe box, and it can't be done. That means there must be something outside of the universe box. that is responsible for the things that are inside the universe box. And that's the theme of his book, God's Crime Scene. I have said many times that the reason that I'm a Christian is because it is the best explanation for the way things are, and the evidence is compelling. If you think not, then can you suggest another alternative that has better explanatory power? And I would add that an atheistic worldview doesn't explain anything. Now, that might be a bit of an overstatement. Someone might want to push back, but I think largely the atheistic worldview is a non-explanation. It just is a way of saying there is no God and everything just is. And maybe, I guess they could say, well, we don't need any explanation, but I actually think they do. What is the evidence or the rationale for atheism? And what's odd about the charge that there is no evidence for God or there is no evidence for Christianity is I actually think it's pretty much entirely accurate to say that there's no evidence for atheism, or virtually no evidence. And this is why I think atheists are so insistent now of saying, well, atheism means I lack a belief in God, and I don't have to give reasons for lacking a belief. I don't have to defend my lack of a belief. Well, of course, that's a boutique definition. It's not the standard definition of atheism, which is the belief that God does not exist. What they want to do is they want to avoid taking on any burden of proof. That is the whole rationale behind this new trend to define atheism as lacking a belief in God. Why would they want to redefine atheism to get them out from underneath any burden of proof? And I think the obvious reason is because they have no proof to give. And so if they can redefine things so it removes the burden from them, then their view will not seem substandard and undefended. So implicit in that move is the acknowledgement that the evidence is not there. And when you face that or put that in comparison to the reams of evidence offered for Christianity or theism in general, it seems a little bit lame to claim there is no evidence for Christianity or for God when, in fact, there is no evidence for the alternative, the atheistic worldview. Maybe it's what I mean, that maybe not lame, I could say it's a little cheeky, because that is the charge that seems to obviously apply to atheists. So anyway, all this to say that it just strikes me as incredibly cheeky for an atheist to claim there is no evidence for God and there is no evidence for Christianity, when in fact there's reams of evidence, whether a person thinks it's adequate or not, and virtually no evidence for atheism. Anyway. All right, let's take a quick break, and we'll come back with your calls on Stand to Reason.